It begins with fire. It begins with a night so still that even the snow on the hills of Fayetteville, West Virginia, seemed to be holding its breath. And it begins with a family, 9 children asleep in their beds, the scent of pine needles and tinsel still fresh in the air from Christmas Eve. By morning, their home would be gone, reduced to blackened timbers and ash. 5 of those children would be gone too. Not just gone in the way fire takes what it touches, but gone in the way the earth seems to swallow something whole and never return it. In the days that followed, strange footprints appeared in the snow. A woman in a Charleston hotel claimed to have seen the missing children. A photograph arrived in the mail decades later, showing a young man who looked exactly like one of the lost boys, grown up. The official explanation insisted they had died in the fire. But the Sodder family believed something else, something darker. And as the years passed, their quiet suspicion grew into an obsession that haunted them to their last breath. Christmas Eve, 1945. In the small coal town of Fayetteville, the war had just ended, and for the first time in years, there was a sense that the world might be returning to normal. Snow had been falling since the late afternoon, dusting the rooftops and weighing down the pine trees that lined the narrow streets. In the Sodder household, the day had been full of noise and movement. Children laughing, the rustle of wrapping paper, the clatter of pots and pans in the kitchen as Jenny Sodder prepared the holiday feast. The Sodder home was a 2-story, wood-frame house set on a piece of land just outside the center of town. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and solid, with a wide front porch and a big window that looked out over the road. Inside, the walls glowed with the reflected light of the tree in the living room. The smell of roast meat and baking bread hung in the air, mingled with the faint tang of coal smoke from the furnace. George Sodder, the father, was a strong man in his 50s, his dark hair now streaked with gray, his hands calloused from years of running his trucking business. He was Italian-born, having emigrated from Sardinia as a young man, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had built his life from nothing. Beside him, Jenny, tall, graceful, with kind eyes that missed nothing, moved between the kitchen and living room, tending to both the meal and the excited chatter of her children. There were 9 of them in all that night. Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny Jr., 8, Betty, 5, and the older siblings John, 23, George Jr., 16, Marion, 17, and Sylvia, just 2 years old. The house was alive with them, darting in and out of rooms, comparing presents, singing snatches of carols. Outside, the snow fell in soft, steady waves, muffling the distant sounds of cars on the road. By 10 p.m., the littlest ones were rubbing their eyes, yawning between bursts of excitement. Jenny began shepherding them toward bed, but some of the middle children pleaded to stay up later. "It's Christmas," they said. "Let us enjoy it a little longer." She relented, telling them not to forget to close the curtains and turn off the lights before they went to sleep. Upstairs, the older boys had already retreated to their shared bedroom, the soft creak of the floorboards marking their steps. George, who had spent the evening in his easy chair by the fire, rose and checked the locks before heading to bed himself. The clock on the mantel showed a few minutes past 10:30. In the kitchen, Jenny lingered to tidy up the last of the dishes, listening to the soft hiss of snow against the windows. She glanced toward the living room once more. The tree lights blinking gently, the fire reduced to glowing embers. It was a peaceful night, or so it seemed. Shortly after midnight, Jenny awoke to the sound of the telephone ringing. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the hall clock. She patted down the stairs in her robe, lifting the receiver to her ear. On the other end, a woman's voice, oddly cheerful, asked for someone Jenny didn't know. Behind her, laughter and clinking glasses, the unmistakable sounds of a holiday party. Jenny told her she had the wrong number. The woman laughed softly before hanging up. As Jenny replaced the receiver, she noticed that the front door was unlocked and the curtains were open. The lights in the living room were still on. Assuming the children had forgotten in their excitement, she turned off the lights, closed the curtains, and locked the door. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, the wind whispering through the bare trees. She returned to bed, but had barely settled when a sharp, heavy sound struck the roof, like something being thrown or dropped. It rolled softly, then silence. A moment later, the scent of smoke reached her. Jenny sat up, heart quickening, the smell growing stronger with each breath. It wasn't the faint, distant scent of coal smoke from the furnace. This was sharp, acrid, and close. She slipped out of bed and padded to the hallway window, scanning the snow-covered yard. Nothing moved outside, but when she turned toward the staircase, a faint orange glow flickered on the walls. Her voice cut through the silence. "George, wake up. The house is on fire." George was out of bed in an instant, pulling on trousers over his nightclothes as he ran for the hallway. The moment he opened their bedroom door, heat rushed in, carrying with it the thickening haze of smoke. From the top of the stairs, Jenny could see flames beginning to lick along the wall of the living room below, racing upward toward the ceiling. They moved quickly, but with the kind of panic that makes every second feel slippery. George shouted for the children upstairs to get out. The two oldest boys, John and George Jr., stumbled from their room, coughing, faces lit by the orange glow below. Marion grabbed little Sylvia from her crib, the toddler wailing at the sudden noise and light. From a landing, Jenny could see that the stairwell was already filling with heat and smoke. The air burned her throat when she called out again for the children. For Maurice, for Martha, for Louis, for Betty, for Jenny Jr., but no answering voices came from upstairs. The fire was moving faster than seemed possible. The Christmas tree lights sparked and popped before vanishing into the smoke. Flames leapt to the curtains, then raced along the wooden beams of the ceiling. George and the older boys tried to push upward toward the bedrooms, but a sudden collapse of part of the staircase forced them back. The heat was unbearable, the smoke thick enough to sting their eyes to tears. George bolted for the side of the house, shouting that he would climb to the upper windows. Outside, the cold night hit him like a shock, snow still falling in thick flakes that hissed and vanished when they touched the heat spilling from the windows. He ran to the side where the ladder always leaned against the wall, but the ladder was gone. Inside, Jenny herded Marion and Sylvia toward the front door. They stumbled out into the snow, nightgowns billowing in the wind, the freezing air biting their skin. Marion turned back toward the house, eyes wide with horror, but the front windows were now sheets of flame. The upstairs shadows moved frantically in George's mind, even if he couldn't see them. He ran to the water barrel by the shed, intending to fill a bucket. But the surface was frozen solid. John and George Jr., coughing violently, tried to force their way back into the house to reach the stairs. But the front room had become an inferno. Wood cracked and splintered under the heat. The air roared with the hungry sound of the flames, drowning out all other noise. George had another idea. He would drive one of his trucks close to the house and climb onto it to reach the upstairs windows. But when he turned the ignition, the truck refused to start. He ran to the other, desperate, fumbling with the keys. It too would not start, though both had worked perfectly the day before. The family stood together in the snow, watching helplessly as the home they had built dissolved in a fire before their eyes. Jenny clutched Sylvia to her chest, the child's sobs muffled in her robe. Marion held her arms around the younger boys, but the gap in their number was a wound already forming. 5 of the Sodder children were still inside. Neighbors began to arrive, alerted by the flames lighting up the night sky. One ran to call the fire department, but the operator's line rang endlessly. Another neighbor drove into town to find the fire chief in person, but the man lacked the ability to drive the truck. The crew would have to assemble, and someone else would have to get them there. The fire raged for 45 minutes before the roof collapsed entirely. By the time the fire department arrived, a full 7 hours later, all that remained of the Sodder home was a smoking pile of ash, twisted metal, and the skeletal outline of the basement walls. The snow had stopped, and the dawn light was gray and cold. The Sodders stood in what had been their yard, their shoes soaked from the melting snow, their faces hollow. George scanned the blackened debris for any sign of the 5 children. There was nothing, no remains, no bones, no ash-covered shapes beneath the rubble. Only the wind, moving through the charred timbers, seemed to speak. By the time the last hiss of steam lifted from the blackened ruins, the sky had shifted from iron gray to the kind of pale blue that makes winter feel even colder. The house was gone. In its place lay a low, smoking mound, dotted with warped nails that glinted like frost whenever the sun flashed out from behind moving clouds. The snow around the foundation had melted into a wet, sooty ring, and the air held that scorched, coppery tang that clings to your clothes and hair long after you've left a fire's edge. George and Ginny stood at different corners of what used to be their home, as if circling a word they could not say. They didn't speak much. There wasn't anything to say that could make sense of the silence where children should have been. Neighbors drifted in clusters, their voices hushed, hands shoved into coat pockets. Some had brought coffee in dented thermoses. Others had simply come to be there because absence demands an audience. Someone was praying. Someone else, a man with a coal dust line etched into the cracks of his knuckles, kept repeating that he didn't understand how fast it had gone from flame to nothing. The firemen picked through the wreckage with long pike poles, turning over boards, raking slowly, as if afraid that moving too quickly would wake something. One of them kept glancing toward Ginny and then away, his face folding and unfolding under a kind of sorrowful duty. Another leaned into the heat with a shovel and came back with a charred length of beam that collapsed at its own weight, flaking into ash as it touched the ground. People expect remains. In any ordinary fire, if a word like ordinary can apply to tragedy, you expect to find evidence of life in the place where life ended. Shaped bone, a fragment, something unmistakably human that insists on being recognized. The longer the hours slipped past, the more the absence took on its own shape. The men sifting the debris did not find bones. They did not find teeth. They did not find anything they could hold up as proof that 5 children had been wholly consumed by flame. The basement, the place where heat collects, where embers continue to burn long after a roof has fallen, revealed little more than globs of melted glass and the curled metal of kitchen utensils. The air moved, and slow spirals of gray lifted and broke apart like breath on a winter day. The fire chief, when he finally stood with George and Ginny, spoke gently, the way a man speaks to the wounded. He used the word cremation, said that at high enough temperatures, in enough time, fire can do what a furnace does, what a kiln does. Ginny nodded because people nod when they're exhausted, when words are both too heavy and too light. But later, when the house was only an outline on the snow and the last official truck had growled away, she stood at the edge of the ruined kitchen and touched the rim of a small pot, its handle gone to slag, and asked herself if a fire that left this little pot could erase 5 bodies so completely that not even a tooth would remain. The thought settled, and it did not leave. Hours became a kind of measurement you carry in your hands. Morning stretched into noon. Relatives came, eyes reddened, collar buttons done wrong in the rush. Marion kept Sylvia close, the toddler's round face shifting from drowsy confusion to sudden, watery wails that pierced the cold and sent heads turning. John and George Jr. moved like men twice their age, helping where they could, lifting, holding, fetching. Every so often, George would stop and scan the tree-line, as if expecting an answer to step out from between the pines and clear its throat. Practicalities summoned themselves almost rudely. A neighbor mentioned the telephone line, how last night it had taken too long to get an operator, how the line might have been down. One of the men walked to the pole near the road, its creosote skin dripping slow black tears in the weak sunlight. He stared at the lower span, where a cable should have run toward the house. When he walked back, he had the careful gait of a messenger trying to find a way to deliver a hard truth without breaking it. "It's cut," he said softly. "Not burned. Cut." He held out a short, dead length of cable like a snake that had been beheaded. Fire eats, it scorches and sears. It doesn't carve clean edges on rubber and copper. George didn't say anything. He looked to the side yard where the wooden ladder should have been propped like always. It wasn't there. He had discovered that in the night, but hadn't had room in his mind to handle it. Now the absence brightened like a bruise under sunlight. a boy from down the road, the kind of boy who knows every ditch and embankment by heart, called out that he'd found something, and a small group followed him to the edge of the property where the ground dropped away into a shallow gully. The ladder lay there in two neat lengths, as though it had been carried and carefully placed, the rungs damp and dark. George knelt and touched it, cold against his palm, and a thin thread of anger colored his breath. Anger has a way of sharpening memory. In the jumbled hours since the fire began, details rose up now with stubborn clarity. The soft, heavy thud on the roof that Jenny had heard before smoke, a sound that had rolled, then stopped. The trucks, both of them, refusing to start, machines that had never failed him deciding to shrug off duty at the exact hour when he needed height and speed. He could hear the cough of their engines in his mind and the nothing that followed. Coincidence is a word for math, he thought. The world does not arrange so many failures without hands. Word had also traveled fast in the small town, how it always does, catching on fences and sliding through parlors. By late afternoon, two men in heavy coats came up the road and lingered at the edge of the property line. One of them had the shoulders of someone who went door to door for a living. The other held himself like a man who'd been unwanted at more than one threshold. George looked up and felt the old debate, grief's instinct to ignore versus something harder, the need to collect and weigh every detail, even when it hurt to hold them. He walked to the fence line. They asked clumsy questions. Had he said something weeks ago about politics? About men from the old country? Had strange cars lingered? The words felt oily. He did not want to touch them. He answered only what he could answer without lying. He'd spoken his mind. When a man has made a life with his hands, it's hard to leave your tongue idle just to keep a neighbor's opinion untroubled. That night, after the last embers sunk into black and the last neighbor went home to sleep off their own helplessness, the Sodders sat at a relative's kitchen table. The borrowed house smelled of onions and soap, and the lamp on the table threw a small, steady circle onto the lace cloth beneath it. Jenny's hands were clean, but her nails held ash. She stared at them, then folded them together to hide the reminder. George spoke mostly to the middle distance, the way a man interrogates a wall that won't answer back. If they were there, he said once, not looking at anyone in particular, we would have found something. He did not raise his voice. He spoke as if he were setting a plank straight before nailing it into place. The room understood it as a declaration, not an invitation. Grief moves in after the disaster like a tenant with too much luggage. It brings its own chair and sits where you mean to walk. It changes the shape of a day. Jenny woke in the night to the echo of that roof sound and the image of 5 faces in a row, each small mouth open as if about to say something. She stared at the ceiling until gray dawn came, and when it did, she got up quietly so as not to jostle the raw shape of the house they had borrowed. In the morning, they went back to the ruins. And then again, the morning after that. By the third day, a thin crust of ice had formed over the damp ash. The firemen came again briefly, more out of duty than hope. A man from town, quiet, careful, brought a long-handled screen and helped sift, patient as a prospector looking for gold he knows he will not find. The sound of ash moving is like a whisper. It says nothing, but it fills the ear. The official word arrived as official words do, stamped with the weight of office, carried by a man who wears a hat for a living. A faulty wire. The paper said, a tragedy built inside the walls that no one could have predicted or prevented. The kind of verdict that asks you to lay down your questions like broken tools and come quietly back into the circle of ordinary life. But curiosity is a form of love, and love will not be told to stand in the yard until it calms down. George and Jenny nodded when the man spoke, because nodding is easier than shouting. When the door shut, they looked at each other and saw the same thing reflected, an inventory of absence. Over the next several days, oddness threaded itself into the fabric of the story. A woman in town mentioned, in a whisper that she did not mean to sound like gossip, that she'd seen a car the night of the fire, idling at the crossroads with its lights off. A boy claimed he'd watched a stranger use a length of chain and a block and tackle to do something to one of George's trucks. A bus driver swore that, from his seat high above the road, He'd seen shapes arc through the falling snow toward the Sodder roof, small, dark, the way a tossed object looks when it has its own business with gravity. None of it rose to the level of proof. All of it, laid end to end, made a path you could walk along without feeling lost. And then there was the yard. Days later, perhaps a week, George found something half sunk in the melt at the edge of the shrub line. Green, hard rubber, with a shape that reminded him of things he'd seen at the mines, in the war pictures that still found their way into newspapers despite everyone's hunger for good news. He held it in his palm and turned it over. The weight of an object can tell you what it was meant to do. He did not say what he feared aloud. He wrapped it in cloth, put it on a shelf where it could be both close and out of sight. At night, Jenny's mind performed equations. How hot a fire must burn, how long it must work to turn bone to powder. She went to the library, its big wooden door cold to the touch, and asked questions that made the librarian sympathetic and careful. She read about crematoriums, about the difference between the heat that devours wood and the heat that erases calcium. She came home and said quietly to George, they should have left something of themselves. He answered with a long breath and the kind of nod that belongs not to agreement, but to confirmation of what a person already knows. Friends visited with casseroles and the thin, shy jokes people bring to a room to pry up an inch of air for breathing. Jenny thanked them. Marion kept helping hands moving, guiding them toward dishes and away from tears. The older boys grew leaner in the face, their eyes always pointed at a distance that had nothing to do with Miles. Sylvia slept poorly, woke at odd hours, and pressed her small palms against Jenny's cheeks as if trying to push her mother's face back into a shape she recognized. In the quiet hours, the house they borrowed felt too full of echoes, as if the floorboards remembered the precise weight of 5 bodies that were supposed to be upstairs. A week after the fire, a letter arrived addressed only to the family name. The ink hurried, as if the writer had been arguing with themselves about sending it. Inside was a review of sympathy in words, and then a little scrap of observation. Someone had seen, perhaps, children who looked like theirs in a car with out-of-town plates, parked behind a small store 2 towns over. People see echoes when they need to, but sometimes an echo is simply a voice taking a different route home. George folded the letter twice, then unfolded it and flattened it with his palm. He did not say whether he believed it. Belief had become a door with hinges rusted by weather. Heavy to move, loud in its own argument. When the burned home was finally cleared, the foundation remained like a chalk outline. George could not bring himself to fill it. He told people he wanted to look again when the ground thawed, to rake when the frost no longer locked ash to earth, to keep searching until the act of searching delivered a verdict more honest than the one stamped in ink. Some nights, he walked the perimeter with a lantern. The light flared in the cold air and made the world immediately around him look warmer than it was. In the distance, the hills were black shapes. The lantern hissed, and the flame inside it wavered when the wind moved, and the sound of his boots in the crust of old snow told him he was not, after all, alone. News travels wider than a town when a story refuses to finish itself. Articles showed up in papers far beyond the county line. The words were careful. Most writers are careful when children are the subject, but they still had teeth. Phrases like mystery, tragedy, unexplained. Strangers sent letters, some kind, a few cruel. A handful were the sort that breed sleeplessness, written by people who enjoy standing at the edge of someone else's grief and shouting back their own theories. Jenny learned to put those aside, unread. George read every word because reading felt like lifting, and lifting is what you do when a thing is too heavy to leave on the ground. One afternoon, a man they did not know came up the rutted drive and asked for George by name. He wore a hat with a sweat-stained band and the sort of smile that says nothing has ever stayed long enough to change him. He introduced himself as a salesman of a certain policy, a helpful service that presumed the world was a ledger where misfortune could be balanced on the other side by monthly payments. He made a pitch. Then, too quickly, as if he'd been carrying the 2 sentences in his pocket all day, he let slip a line about homes that go up in smoke and children that don't make it out. Perhaps he meant nothing by it. Perhaps the words had been chosen with care. After he left, George stood for a long time by the fence, gripping the post until his knuckles took on the color of old paper. The mind, when it cannot find closure, becomes a loom. It pulls threads from memory and threads from rumor and threads from the hard, stubborn facts and sets them together. The tapestry it makes is not always beautiful, and it isn't always fair, but it is something to point at when people ask you what you think happened. In that early winter, the Sodder's loom worked constantly. Cut telephone lines, a missing ladder found where no one put it, trucks that slept when they were needed awake, a thud on the roof, no bodies, no bones, no teeth, a found object of green rubber. Strangers in cars with their lights off at crossroads that usually held only dark and wind and the occasional fox. These were not where the story ended. They were where it began to become something too large for a simple page. And still, the days came and went. Jenny learned how to measure them again by the way light slipped across the kitchen table they were borrowing, by the way Sylvia's hair seemed to grow between mornings, by the way evenings leaned earlier into the windows. When she slept, she dreamed of steps on the stairs and woke with her hand reaching toward a door that was not there. George kept going to the foundation until the weather told him to stop. He stood at the rectangle of what used to be a home and pressed his boot into wet soil and thought of footprints, of the way a mark can affirm a presence, and of how even mud remembers. He imagined, sometimes something else remembering too. A person, a face seen by the wrong person in the wrong place, a small hand held in a car that did not belong to the person holding it. In that space between what you can prove and what you cannot bear not to believe, a new kind of day began to take shape. The kind of day that knows it will be followed by a search, and then another, and then another. The kind that understands that absence, when it will not yield to explanation, becomes a terrain you must learn to walk without getting lost. The first report came down like snowfall, soft in tone, but steady in its accumulation until it covered everything in a cold, uniform layer. The official cause of the fire, the fire marshal said, was faulty wiring, a tragedy of mechanics, a fault in the veins of the house itself. He spoke as if it were a matter already settled, the kind that could be folded neatly and filed away. For the Sodders, the words were not enough to close the lid. They sat like something unfinished, a piece of wood with splinters still in it. Jenny thought about the house's wiring constantly in those days. She had noticed nothing unusual before the fire. In fact, she remembered the electrician who had recently inspected the place. He'd said the wiring was in good condition. The Christmas lights had been burning all evening without a flicker. And in the final minutes before smoke had filled the air, she had turned off the lights herself after locking the door. How could wiring be faulty in a house where the lights glowed strong, right until the moment they were switched off? It was a question she asked aloud to George more than once, and each time his brow furrowed deeper, the lines on his forehead catching shadows. The town moved on as towns do. People have their own hearths to tend, their own tables to fill. But for George and Jenny, the space in their home was not just emptiness. It was a vacancy filled with suspicion. And so, slowly at first, then with more deliberate pace, they began their own investigation. George started with the missing ladder. The day after finding in the gully, he tried to picture how it had gotten there. He kept turning the idea over. Someone must have moved it. Someone who wanted to keep it from being used during the fire. It was a thought that gnawed at him, especially in the quiet hours before dawn, when even grief seemed to sleep and only suspicion kept watch. Then there were the trucks. George had driven them both earlier that week. Both had run perfectly. For both to fail at the exact same time on the exact same night seemed too neat to be mere chance. He asked around. Mechanics in town shook their heads, muttering about fuel lines, starters, sabotage. None of them gave a firm answer. Word of strange things seen on Christmas Eve began to reach them, carried by neighbors or friends in hushed tones. One woman, living just outside town, claimed she saw the children in a car that passed her house late that night. She'd noticed because it was rare for any car to be on the road at that hour, especially in the snow, and because the children looked subdued, their faces turned toward the windows as if watching the dark pass by. A bus driver came forward too. On the night of the fire, he'd been driving his route along the highway. Near the Sodder property, he said he saw people in the distance, parked in a car off the road, lights off, the shape of the vehicle almost erased by the falling snow. In the glow from his own headlights, he thought he saw someone moving toward the house. It was a brief image, over in a heartbeat, but enough to stay with him. Then came the first letter. It was not signed, and the handwriting was blocky and deliberate, as though the writer was trying to mask their usual style. It said simply that the children were alive, taken, not burned, that they were in good hands. The writer claimed to know where they were, but the letter offered no name, no address, only the suggestion that they were safe and would not be returned. It was the kind of message that feeds a fire inside a parent's heart, a flame that burns alongside the grief but never quite meets it. George and Ginny didn't know whether to believe it, but they also couldn't ignore it. That's how hope works when it's mixed with dread. You lean toward it, even when it might hurt you to do so. The sightings began to multiply. In a small tourist stop in Charleston, a hotel clerk claimed to have seen 4 of the Sodder children weeks after the fire. She described them in detail, their clothing, their hair, the way one of the girls never spoke, letting the older boy answer for her. They were with 2 men and 2 women, all well-dressed and seemingly in a hurry. The group did not linger in a lobby, she said, and they checked in late without luggage. Ginny listened to every account, her face calm, but her hands twisting the edge of her apron. She knew there was no way to prove these stories, but each one was another drop in the bucket of her suspicion. George began to travel more, to follow up on leads himself, knocking on doors, walking into diners, asking questions in places where people didn't always welcome them. He returned home each time without the children, but with more pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. The image of that night began to change in their minds. No longer was it just fire and smoke and the roar of timber giving way. Now there were shadows in the snow, a cut telephone line, a missing ladder, silent trucks, a strange thud on the roof, cars parked in the dark, and the possibility, small but solid, that the children had been taken. The official report sat on the corner of their table for weeks, its pages curling slightly from the heat of the stove. Neither of them touched it. It was a verdict they did not accept, and in its place, they began to write their own version, one detail at a time. By the spring of 1946, George and Ginny had grown tired of quiet inquiries and whispered conversations. They realized the investigation, if it could still be called that, had stalled. Officials had no plans to search further, no desire to reopen the case, and no intention of considering alternate explanations. If the Sodders wanted answers, they would have to stir the waters themselves. They started small, a letter to a local newspaper, asking for anyone with information to come forward. Notices pinned to church bulletin boards and the walls of general stores. Quiet visits to neighboring towns where George would sit in small diners, striking up conversations with strangers and slipping their story into the gaps. But this scattershot approach yielded little more than sympathy and the occasional vague lead. It was Ginny who suggested something bigger, something no one could miss. In August 1946, George hired workers to erect a massive billboard along Route 16, just outside Fayetteville, where every driver coming into town would see it. Bold black letters spelled out the question at the heart of their lives. 5 Sodder children missing. What was their fate? Beneath it were photographs of each missing child, taken from family portraits and school pictures, arranged in a row like an accusation. Underneath, a brief summary of the night's events and the promise of a reward for any information. The billboard was impossible to ignore. It became a landmark, not just for Fayetteville, but for travelers passing through. People stopped to stare, some snapping photographs, others making notes to send along to relatives in nearby towns. Over time, George and Ginny kept it updated. New leads were added, details revised. The billboard stayed in place for decades, a physical embodiment of their refusal to let the case die. The effect was immediate. Leads began trickling in again. Most were dead ends, mistaken identities, rumors with no basis, but a few were enough to make George pack a bag and follow the trail. One such lead came from a woman in St. Louis, Missouri, who claimed she'd overheard a conversation in a bar between two men discussing a fire in West Virginia and children who'd been taken. George drove over 500 miles to speak to her in person. She seemed nervous, reluctant to say much more, and when he returned home, he was no closer to answers. But the trip had done something to him. It confirmed that people were still talking, somewhere, somehow, about his children. In 1947, a letter arrived from a woman in Florida. She claimed to have been an acquaintance of one of the Sodder children, now grown, who allegedly confided in her that he had been taken and raised under a different name. The woman refused to give specifics, citing fear for her own safety, and correspondence with her eventually stopped without resolution. The most haunting lead, though, would not come until nearly 2 decades later. In 1967, Jenny went to the mailbox and found a plain envelope addressed only to her. The postmark was from Kentucky, but there was no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed a young man in his 20s, dark-haired, with deep-set eyes and strong, familiar features. On the back was scrawled, in neat block letters, "Louis Sodder, I love Brother Frankie. Ill boys. A 90132 or 35. Jenny stared at the photograph for a long time before calling George in from the yard. When he saw it, he didn't speak. He didn't need to. Both knew immediately why their hands were shaking. The resemblance to Louis, their son who had been 9 at the time of the fire, was uncanny. The numbers and letters on the back were a mystery. A code, perhaps. An address. Or maybe nothing at all. George and Jenny hired a private investigator in Kentucky to follow the lead, but the man disappeared without a trace after setting out. No final report, no explanation, just gone. That photograph became one of Jenny's most treasured and most painful possessions. She framed it, hung it in the living room beside the portraits of the missing children, and looked at it every day until her death. Over the years, there were other sightings. A woman claimed to have seen Martha in a convent in Minnesota. A man in Houston swore he met Maurice in a bar, though the man he identified denied knowing anything about the Sodder family. The reports piled up in drawers and boxes, each one labeled, dated, and filed by Jenny with the same care you'd give to a fragile heirloom. Not everyone approved. Some neighbors saw the billboard and the constant leads as an inability to move on, a wound kept open by choice. But for George and Jenny, moving on was never an option. "If I gave up," George once said, "it would be like killing them twice." In the final decades of their lives, George and Jenny never stopped looking. The billboard on Route 16 became a fixture of the landscape, as much a part of Fayetteville as the post office or the church steeple. It stood there for nearly 4 decades, weathered but unyielding, a silent witness to the questions no one had answered. Travelers would pull over to read it, sometimes taking photos, sometimes leaving notes under the Sodder's front door. George died in 1969, still without knowing the truth. Jenny lived another 20 years, wearing black every single day after the fire, a quiet uniform of mourning that she never abandoned. She kept the framed photograph from Kentucky on her wall, studying it as if, by sheer will, she could make the young man in it step forward into her life. By the time Jenny passed in 1989, the search had shifted to the Sodder children who had survived the fire. They, too, had grown older, carrying their parents' questions forward. Some pursued leads in their spare time. Others simply guarded the family's records, refusing to let the story vanish. The billboard finally came down in the early 1990s. It would too rotted to stand. But the absence of the sign didn't erase the story. By then, it had already entered local legend, a tale parents told to their children, a reminder that sometimes the past does not rest quietly. The fate of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty Sodder remains one of America's most enduring unsolved mysteries. Were they taken that night? Did they perish in a way that left no trace? Or did they live on under other names, other lives, never knowing how fiercely they were sought? No one can say for certain. But for over 40 years, a family refused to let their story fade into the background. And in that refusal, In that endless, stubborn act of hope, they left a mark deeper than the fire ever could. The fate of Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty Sodder remains one of America's most enduring unsolved mysteries. Were they taken that night? Did they perish in a way that left no trace? Or did they live on under other names, other lives, never knowing how fiercely they were sought? No one can say for certain. But for over 40 years, a family refused to let their story fade into the background. And in that refusal, in that endless, stubborn act of hope, they left a mark deeper than the fire ever could. Thank you for listening to the story of the Sodder children, a haunting, unsolved mystery that has captivated hearts and minds for decades. If you enjoyed this journey into one of history's most perplexing true crime cases, feel free to explore more captivating stories right here on this channel. There are many more mysteries waiting to be told.